So this is Jim McRitchie and Eric Weinstein of Corporate Accountability Forums. And today we're going to talk about Universal Proxy Cards, and it promises to be to allow the kind of ESG involvement that many of us hoped for in 2002 when I petitioned the SEC to allow proxy access. And proxy access kind of got waylaid along the way and has really never taken off. But the use of universal proxy cards does more than just allow people to vote the way they want without going to the meeting. It also, I think, will provoke more contests and facilitate that a little bit more. However, there is kind of a fly in the ointment, and that is a number of companies have started to write advance notice bylaws that could be problematic. And so I am trying to head that off. I'm filing, I think I've filed a dozen proposals in the last few days on advance notice bylaws, asking that those that tilt the playing field at least be put to a shareholder vote. So with that, we have with us today two guests, Michael Levin, Michael Levin,
okay.
and John Grau, John Grau. All right, so here, I asked for the pronunciations beforehand and screwed it up anyway. So anyway, there are two people that I think you're going to learn a lot from. And I'm just going to turn it over to Michael. He'll start out with a little bit about universal proxy cards, because he's been following the rules and the developments here quite a bit. And then John will follow up with some more nuts and bolts kinds of things. I would ask that since we have a lot of people today, that you type your questions into the chat function, and then we'll grab them out, or if it looks like we have more time than I think we do, we might bring you on, but we're more likely to read the questions and try to group them or whatever. So, and we'll probably start with most of the questions after the presentations are done, but you can put them in there, and if we need to do it, we'll pull it right out. Okay, Michael, how about we start with you?
Over to me. Terrific. I'm Mike Levin. Do some activist investing and also advise on activist investing situations. A couple of very preliminary remarks. We only have a whole hour for this, and each of us only has a few minutes to cover some material, and we want to leave ample time to for question and discussion. So I'll cover a few essentials about the Universal Proxy Card rule and how it works. There's a lot more information available. There's a website, universalproxycard.com, where you can look for a lot more information. There's a link to the SEC rule and interpretations. There's a series of posts that were written that explain this, some FAQs and so forth. So I would commend that to you if you want to really delve into this. You can also sign up. There's a weekly email that gets sent out on Fridays with updates on Universal Proxy Card. You can sign up there as well. So we've heard from, and I'll start advising, a range of investors on Universal Proxy Card. There's some of the typical old-fashioned hedge fund investors, and then a number of ESG proponents that have started to look at this, a number of ESG proponents that have really only focused their energies on submitting proposals, non-binding proposals in the past, that are now starting to think hard about how Universal Proxy Card will help them. And the sense from all this, from these discussions and some of the work that has been done, is that this, sort of on its surface, a routine change in a rule actually would have significant, possibly even profound positive implications for activist investors and also for shareholders. And the likely outcome there is it will shift some power in director elections to activists and shareholders and away from companies. And as a consequence, companies have started to react in various ways. The most typical reaction has been to start to amend bylaws, essentially to make life a little harder, or possibly a lot harder, for activist investors. So we will focus some of the comments and discussion on some of those bylaw changes a little later here. What I'd like to cover now is just some of the essentials. There's a number of points to cover. I'd like to mention basically 5 of them. So we'll talk about some of the basics of the Universal Proxy Card rule. First thing is it's effective now. It actually, even though it was approved in November of 2021, it went into force on September 1st of this year. So any annual shareholder meetings from here on out would be subject to the Universal Proxy Card rules from the SEC. Second point is it pertains only to contested director elections. So, situations where there is an activist, could be a hedge fund, could be an ESG proponent, that is nominating competing candidates against company incumbents. It does not pertain to routine elections, which are, up until now have been, the vast majority of board elections where there is no dissident or no activist candidates. And it really doesn't have anything to do with any kind of shareholder votes and other matters, such as ESG proposals or the auditor or equity plans or whatever. This is only contested director elections. And as I started mentioning, this started out seemingly like a little bit of a routine change. Sort of in a nutshell, it requires the company and the activist to list all the director candidates basically on a single ballot, on a single proxy card. And now, in any kind of situation where an activist has nominated one or more candidates, shareholders will receive, and the activist and the company will send out a single piece of paper, a single card listing everybody. They'll list them in certain ways. They have to be separated and formatted in certain manner, but essentially that card lists everybody. So therefore, a shareholder that is voting using that ballot or that card can pick and choose from among all the available candidates. So if a shareholder is outraged and irate and wants the activist candidates all the way through, can vote for all of them. A very contented shareholder that likes what management is doing can ignore all the activist candidates and vote only for the company incumbents. But what's really interesting is now shareholders can pick and choose. They can vote for some incumbents, some dissidents, some activists, one activist and the rest incumbents or whatever. So they can express their preferences for what the board looks like in a much more nuanced way. Just to remind ourselves, before this, a shareholder that really didn't have that ability, they could really only vote just for either the list of company candidates or the list of activist candidates. A determined shareholder that wanted to go through the hassle and spend some money could get a legal proxy and could figure out a way to mix and match their votes, but most of the time it was just one or the other. So that's really not true anymore. You can mix and match your votes, and there's some very profound and nuanced implications to being able to do that, which I'll cover in a minute. So that was the second point. The third point. The fourth point I want to make is that there is one new requirement that does apply to activist investors as a consequence of this. And that's this 67% solicitation threshold. So essentially, any activist that decides to nominate candidates at any U.S. company now has to indicate that they will solicit 67%, minimum of 60% of the available votes at that company. So you have to go to the effort to send out proxy materials, or there's other more resourceful ways to do that a little more cheaply using notice and access. But you have to go try to reach 2/3 of the available votes. Now, let me say right away, this is not 2/3 of all shareholders. So a company with thousands and thousands of shareholders, you don't have to reach 2/3 of them. You have to make an effort to reach 2/3 of the available votes. So realistically, at many companies, and the SEC did a pretty neat economic analysis of this, at most companies, you can hit that 67% threshold if you're an activist by, for a smaller company soliciting a few dozen shareholders. They will make up the 67%. At the very largest companies, the multi-billion-dollar market cap companies, we're talking about a few hundred shareholders. But nonetheless, you really need to at least make an effort to solicit to that minimum level. The SEC built this in to attempt to screen out only, so to speak, serious proponents. But in reality, to, like I said, a resourceful activist, this should not pose much of an obstacle. The last point I'll make, there are some notice and some formatting rules. There's some detail there that is really of interest only to corporate governance junkies and aficionados among ourselves. That's me and John, and the securities lawyers that are with us on the call today. And I would, again, you can go to the universityproxycard.com website and find a link to the SEC rule and some other interpretations that will help you understand some of those other essentials. So to recap on the main points I want to make on the main basics, the rules effective now pertains only to contested director elections, not to routine non-contested elections or shareholder proposals. It lists, basically there's a ballot that lists all the candidates, so you can mix and match. You have to think about this 67% threshold. And then finally, there are some more detailed notice and formatting rules that try to make the two ballots equivalent. And you can go to the link to figure those out. Let me close with a couple of quick comments about some of the implications of these seemingly technical changes. There's really two, related to cost and related to strategy. Though the rule itself doesn't per se or directly lower the cost dramatically, it did show the way to a lot of activists that are paying attention how you can pursue a proxy contest a lot more efficiently and at a somewhat lower cost than maybe people had been thinking about this before. Some of the tools are always available, but the idea of the company providing space on their proxy card for activist nominees does make life somewhat easier. But there's a perception, it's largely true, that now that activists can really undertake these seemingly daunting projects at possibly a somewhat lower cost than they'd thought was possibly feasible. And as a consequence, there's potentially going to be a lot more proxy contests going forward. How many more? No one really knows. Whether it's going to be in the dozens or hundreds, no one's quite sure. But there's a number of proponents of activist investors that have started to really consider these kind of situations where they had never really thought of before. In particular, there's a wide range of ESG advocates that have now started to consider a proxy contest at one or another company. They had been content to submit non-binding proposals in the past and try to see their support grow over time. But as a way to get company attention and try to possibly escalate their thesis, proxy contests are now much more on their mind. The other interesting consequence of this lower cost factor is that it's likely we're going to see many more instances of multiple activists working at a given company. Up until now, that's been relatively rare. If we get one or two in a year where there's more than one activist running a proxy contest, that would be a little unusual. But now we're expecting many more. How many more? Not exactly sure. But at some of the biggest companies where there have been many shareholder proposals submitted, those may start to turn into proxy contests. And then finally, as we started to say, the strategies also starting to shift. So it's not just more contests, but how contests are undertaken. In particular, we're expecting contests to become a lot more personal. We mentioned how shareholders now start to compare individual candidates on a single ballot. The idea that instead of voting just for a company or an activist's case, you can vote for individual candidates has enormous implications for how an activist starts to persuade shareholders to vote for individual candidates, how they connect those candidates to their thesis for the company and so forth. So a lot of personal content, a lot more personal contests seems to be on the horizon as shareholders start to compare individual candidates. There's some other strategic implications related to how activist structure slates, how much bigger, potentially they could be somewhat bigger and so forth, and how you could start to win support with potentially fewer shares, fewer votes than you'd been accustomed to trying to solicit. But again, those are a little more advanced here. I think the main points we wanted to get at was that there's going to be possibly, somewhat more contests because there's perception that the costs are lower, and the strategy for trying to pursue these contests and win them is potentially going to start to change. So those were some of the essentials and a couple of the strategic implications that I wanted to make sure we covered. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions, but we want to get to some of John's thoughts before we do that.
All right. And before you start, John, let me just mention here by way of background that I had, so one of the things that prompted me to hold this forum was that I belong to a big tent group at ICCR, and we're considering all the proxy proposals at Amazon. And I think there was 20 proposals on the ballot last year, and maybe another 10 that didn't make it to the ballot. So I thought if we could, steer some of our efforts, instead of focusing on all those proxy proposals, which I view as trying to deal with the symptoms of the problems at Amazon, if we could get different people on the board, then that'd be very helpful. So I was looking at a really large company, but after looking at this a little bit more, one of the people I ran into was Dorothy Carvello, who's self-nominated at Warner Brothers Music, and Dorothy wrote a book on sexual harassment in the music industry, and I don't think she doesn't have much of a chance to get elected to the Warner music board because they have a dual class share structure. But it took 12 emails to meet the 67% proxy solicitation process. So that is a very inexpensive process to get her on the ballot. So John, that's an unusual case, but what we're looking for is, what is the low price way to get into this? I'm sure, we can go full bore proxy contests, as many have done in the past, but I'm particularly looking at the lower cost angles.
Sure.
Thanks, John, and good to hear from you.
No, glad to be here. Again, John Glenn, I'm the head of InvestorCom, the proxy solicitation firm. So again, as proxy solicitors, we're essentially looking at the plumbing of the proxy process. We're well-dressed plumbers here. And we want to get behind the scenes of how to effectively solicit shareholders, given the current rules, and how to go about offering the best strategic advice for getting the votes and getting the messaging out to stockholders. And just to reiterate on what Michael had said, back in the past where a dissident slate had their own proxy card, sent out a proxy card with their own nominees, set of proxy material, management had their own set of proxies, their own proxy card. Now, when a stockholder receives material, they're looking at the full combined nominees for both sides. These days, it's very compelling and interesting for a stockholder. And what we're seeing is almost like a political election. The individual characteristics of each nominee has had the bar raised for them. So it's that much more important certainly for management's nominees to be on their toes and to shine, but also an opportunity for an activist, an individual activist, to really be on there on management's proxy and have that opportunity for election. But as it pertains to a case like Amazon, and I was saying we're the proxy plumbers out there. We have to bear in mind that, sure, anybody can, mail on a certain scale materials to stockholders. And whether you do a notice and access mailing for an expensive distribution or a partial distribution, there's a way to be cost effective, but I just want to start by saying that this is still a campaign, right? There still needs to be a platform for the activist. There has to be written materials. There has to be press releases. There has to be a well-crafted message that involves, whether it be a team of advisors or a very experienced activist who knows what they're doing. So I don't want to send the wrong message by just saying that anybody can put up an ESG campaign and successfully do so. However, an experienced, credible activist can put up a qualified campaign for the right company using a universal proxy card. And if they calibrate their costs correctly, they can do it in a very effective way with the right messaging and hit the right audience, and using the 67% solicitation rule, get to the right people, particularly if their nominee or nominees are qualified enough to meet the proxy advisory firm's recommendations and kind of surpass their guidelines, and obviously the guidelines of those institutional investors. That is certainly an avenue for a very successful campaign. But I want to also stress that, and I know that most of us on this meeting realize this, but not every company is alike. So it takes an incredible amount of work to choose the correct company to target. You have to know how the institutional holders vote. You need to know what the balance is between who works with proxy advisory firms, ISS and Glass Lewis, who doesn't. You really need to know the mix between retail holders and non-retail holders, so you can truly establish that 67% mix of holders, so you know precisely who you're targeting and if you can effectively target those holders, because not all of that information is public. So there is some background work to do on that. But what I'm seeing is that, I haven't had, when the Universal Proxy rules first came out, I thought I would have a rush of activists come to me wanting to do a bunch of proxy contests. And I thought that many of those activists would be the smallest of small ones. That's actually not the case. I'm getting more inquiries about some larger companies wanting to do some more credible campaigns on larger firms, a couple ESG related, and then of course some smaller ones, but most of the UPC proxy fights are much more credible than I was expecting, and much less, if you would, gadfly related. Maybe a term from the 80s or 90s, I'm not sure. But so we are seeing thus far, and I know it's very early, we are seeing a fairly prudent use or thought process behind these rules so far. So in terms of cost, if calibrated, just to hit a little more specifically on your point, Jim, in terms of cost, there's a cost to a campaign, right? It's not just, how do you mail, or how do you disseminate a proxy and get it out for the least cost and get your name on the ballot. It's more than that, but it's not. There are certainly very, very efficient ways of running a universal proxy campaign, as you had suggested. And it really just depends upon doing it. It depends upon the company, it depends upon the ownership. And as you suggested in the case of Amazon, there's certainly ways of doing it without incurring, the millions and millions and millions of dollars that one would expect.
Yeah. So I looked at my own portfolio. I've got about 200 companies in my portfolio, and about half of them you could reach 67% just through institutional investors. So which I guess that's pretty much in line with what has been noted. But Amazon was not one of them. So because I guess it's got a lot of retail shareholders, it's more retail facing than a lot of other companies. So so any idea of like what a basic contest would cost there?
Or at Amazon?
Yes.
Oh my God. I don't know, John. That's an interesting question. I mean, that's one of the top 3 or 4 largest out
It's
there.
a big company.
Yeah, I mean that would in terms of the basics, just to actually hit 67%, there's probably if you wanted to just use notice and access, just use electronic means. It'll probably still require something in the high 5-figure or 6-figure, and that's just to be on the ballot. That has nothing about how well you solicit or so just the basic entry level cost to solicit the 67% is got to be in the low 6 figures. But beyond that, of course, you want to figure out what it's going to take to succeed, and that's going to take a lot more money, right, John?
Agreed. I'm apprehensive to give pricing estimates to individuals on the phone, let
Sure.
alone a large group like this. So
Yeah, I understand that.
I would agree. I would agree with Michael. But a lot of it is how, and I just posed this question, to this group here. I mean, how creative can one get with the idea of solicitation to 2/3 of the shareholders? And, what would that involve? And really digging into the shareholder base. How deep can you go? What percentage can you go with just outreach to the institutions, and what percentage does that get you to? And then where do you make up the rest? So, there's just a way of how does one slice and dice the shareholder base to get you to the 2/3 solicitation?
Right. So, yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, well, and so in my portfolio, I saw there were some companies where I could get there with 12 institutional investors. Then of course, you have to look at those institutional investors and how likely are they to vote for your candidate, and then where do you come up with those candidates? I did talk to a group that that lists, that will help you search for candidates. And I think, they might get a little bit more business with Universal Proxy Cards. And I think that we are going to see a lot more. Like right now, the candidate statements, they're pretty dry. This is my background. I've yet to see a candidate statement for an uncontested election where they talk about what they hope to accomplish at the company. That'd be highly unusual. And that reminds me, I ran for the CalPERS board years ago, and the fellow I ran against, violated the rules and changed his candidate statement after they were allowed to, after it was supposed to be shut down. And then, because I had mentioned corruption at CalPERS, I had mentioned, taking gifts, and I had testified before Adam Schiff. He was a state senator back then. And so then CalPERS passed a rule that said in the future, candidate statements could only mention their background. They could not mention anything about why they were running or anything about the other candidates. But then I got the press on that, and they overturned that. They rescinded the rule. But I can see, do you see a possibility where candidates will be listing what they hope to accomplish at companies, or is that too much to hope for?
There's an I mean, the activists that are doing this right, they're doing this well, are realizing that there's going to be this individual assessment of individuals, not just the assessment of your thesis for the company and your plan for the company. And they are connecting individual credentials, background, experience, expertise to the activist's thesis, and showing how that is a very well-organized team, and that those candidates are able to meet the needs of the thesis in a way that the incumbents are kind of failing the company. Right. And so that's the way in which individual credentials matter. It's not just that someone's, distinguished and has experience on boards or something, but there's a very direct connection between those credentials and what the activist hopes to accomplish at a company. So if it has to do with, sustainability, that activist has, those candidates have sort of very specific experience there. If it has to do with, governance changes, that person has, is an expert in that aspect of governance, but you got to really connect the individual credentials of your candidate. You got to look for that when you're recruiting candidates. That's one of the big challenges when we're talking to ESG proponents lately that have no experience, understandably, with running a proxy contest. They're looking for people to serve on a slate, and we're saying this is what you really need to do. This is what you want to accomplish at a company, a portfolio company, and here's what you need to look for in individuals to try to reinforce that. You can't just get any old, some warm body or someone who's eager and has a lot of, things to say about the company, but you have to really connect it to your, to what you want to accomplish. Yeah.
Board experience and experience in the field that you're
right,
where the need
exactly.
is. I think we saw that at the
Right.
Exxon contest. So,
Yep, absolutely.
but it wasn't really an ESG contest as far as I'm concerned. It was more, okay, we need some industry experts on the Exxon board.
Right. Yep.
So let's see, Eric is asking, how do you anticipate companies responding to UPC in terms of defense, whether it be bylaw changes, ownership requirements, etc.?
I can respond to that briefly, and then maybe John has a thought. So, and actually, I wrote a post on this that looks at this, is that the typical response to SEC regs is to challenge the reg. That happened a lot with the proxy advisor reg. That hasn't really happened. It's been almost a year. Another response is to try to litigate this or sue company activists over this. That hasn't really happened. So the main response has been to make it harder for activists to nominate candidates and to pursue the election. So there's actually been sort of two ends to this with Universal Proxy. There have been a couple of more direct responses in bylaw amendments to Universal Proxy. And then there have been some much more broader indirect ones, which actually get to be pretty interesting. And that gets to the heart of what you were interested in, Jim. The responses on UPC were pretty routine and shouldn't really concern any serious activist that wants to try to take advantage of UPC for a proxy contest, whether they're a hedge fund or an ESG proponent. First, it was basically just to codify the regulation in company bylaws. Right. Essentially to say that, whatever the SEC is requiring is now a matter of Delaware state law. So basically just updating regs to bylaws, to reflect the regulation. And it's pretty routine. That's pretty standard. The other interesting bylaw change directly as a consequence of Universal Proxy was to put some teeth into the 67% requirement. The 67% requirement in the SEC regs is actually a little vague in a couple places. It doesn't have a whole lot of authority or a lot of force. In particular, someone who really wants to, push the boundaries of that reg could say, I intend to solicit 67%, and the day of the annual meeting still say, I'm still intending, still working on my 67%. Okay, well, a few companies, and we wrote about this, have started to write bylaws that say, okay, 5 days before the meeting, you need to show evidence of your 67%. You need to send us, or your proxy solicitor needs to send us all the mailing that you did, or identify the people. And the bylaws aren't really specific about what constitutes good evidence, but they're now starting to require companies, activists, to sort of show that they did this solicitation. I looked at one of the bylaws where this was United Airlines Holdings, if you want to look it up, which has some illustrative language about how this works. But beyond that, companies have started to use these kind of basic or pretty conforming changes in bylaws to really start to do some really interesting things that really make life potentially very hard for activists. ESG and hedge fund activists to try to do this with all sorts of interesting and onerous changes to bylaws, all revolving around advance notice and what you have to provide in advance notice filings. So, Jim, that's what I know you've been starting to think hard about. So
Yeah.
those are sort of this offshoot, this consequence of universal proxy bylaw.
One of the things that got me was Matt Levine had a Bloomberg post on Massimo, is it? I think.
Right, MASI, that company. Yeah.
Yeah, and they basically, he came back with, okay, they're going to be starting to require it be submitted on paper made from unicorn mane,
Right.
manes and in gold ink. But then they, of course, exempted their own. They put a bunch of requirements on the Universal Proxy Card candidates that would not apply to their own candidates. So,
Right.
So I'm basically asking that companies don't exempt their own candidates from the requirements that they're imposing on others and some other things. So,
Right. So the answer to the question was mostly bylaw changes. Go ahead, John. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think there has to be something more concrete that develops with the requirement to solicit 67% of the shareholders. There has to be some proof of that, even as far, I don't know if this is too extreme, but even as far as to do a mailing to those shareholders, or just some definitive proof that those shareholders have been soliciting.
Right. So Eric, that was really the response, but it's also very early. There's some very novel and, like I said, some very onerous bylaw amendments that companies have been adapting to, again, make life really hard for their shareholders. We can debate whether they're worthwhile or whether they're enforceable and so forth. But that's at least been the overall response from companies. And there have probably been about 80 or 90, by my count, U.S. companies that have so amended their bylaws to reflect UPC, and some of them started to sneak in some of these other more serious changes.
well, Michael, as you review those, I would appreciate if you let me know of the more problematic ones. I'm
not reading all of them. I'm just sort of
Well, I've just I filed about a dozen proposals that companies, and if people are interested, contact me afterwards. But to at least address some on a high level. But I'm sure people there can be very creative in sneaking in kind of poison pills into these bylaw provisions.
Yeah, we just saw one. I didn't write this up yet, where some bylaw, I can't remember the company, was proposing that if a shareholder, if an activist goes somewhat through the process of nominating candidates and so forth, and somehow fails to solicit the 67%, that the company is going to impose a cost on them, that they have to reimburse the company for the cost of redoing a proxy solicitation that doesn't include the activist candidates because they failed again, because you got to reprint all the proxy stuff and redo it and so forth. So they're putting in the bylaws that they would want to seek reimbursement from the candidate, and I am eager to see what Delaware Chancery Court would say to that.
Yeah. Well, when I talked to Dorothy, I was just a short conversation. I was hoping she would join us this morning, but she was meeting with attorneys and couldn't do that. But the impression I got is that she could email these 12 owners of Warner Brothers, and that would get her on the proxy. So maybe I haven't done this, so
right.
I don't know the process. But
John, do you want to comment
what constitutes the solicitation
about what notice and access involves?
Yeah.
There's some of the folks on our call already know that, but there's some others who are probably not familiar. So,
notice and access involves allowing rather than sending out a full proxy statement, it allows you to send out a notice of internet availability of your proxy. So it's a cost savings in that you're not mailing a full proxy statement, you're not printing a proxy statement, you're just essentially mailing a little postcard saying that here, go to this website and you can see our proxy and here's a link to vote.
Right.
But does it even require a postcard? You can just email, right?
Oh, and for those holders who receive notification by email, they receive it by email.
Yeah.
I mean, you still have to work through, Broadridge or some other shareholder communications firm, whichever one they're using, and they'll get their pound of flesh out of that.
Uh-huh.
But you still, yes, you can do it a lot more efficiently and than by mailing, full sets, literally mailing full sets of printed material to thousands of individual shareholders.
And so the printed material that you'd be referring to would be your kind of your platform and your candidates and what they're all about, or what more is
it's a statement. It's a lengthy, or as lengthy as you want it to be, statement. And there's some legal requirement. The SEC has some some basic requirements about what goes into proxy materials.
Uh-huh.
But you can add, all sorts of credentials. You can, put your case, your critique of the company in there. There's an actual card you have to include, what the actual card looks like. And then, if you want to do news releases and subsequent materials, there's all sorts of stuff that you then have to, mail, and notice and access makes it easy. You just put it all on a website, or
Right,
just post a dagger.
What a lot of activists do, they just host their own website, put up all of their campaign materials. They can, release their, notification through notice and access, but they have a much more user-friendly and probably nicer looking campaign on their proxy contest website.
Right. Well, and do you, so have traditional activists made much use out of social media, for example? I mean, I look at, okay, if I wanted to run a cheap campaign, the way to do it would be to use, Twitter and Facebook and, whatever else to read out of, but I don't know if that actually reaches,
I would expect, I mean, most traditional proxy contests have been from hedge funds, have not been sort of focused on some of the ESG proponents that we are starting to sense will get a lot more active as a consequence of this. And so they've, obviously they have a lot more money to spend on this kind of thing. They tend to focus on a lot of institutions, and not as much on individuals. There's exceptions, at Procter and Gamble or DuPont or some of the more notable huge contests in the past, there was a need to solicit individuals. And so there hasn't quite been the attention paid to social media as a means of promoting your case and so forth. I'm kind of expecting that resourceful ESG proponents that are, really adept at trying to communicate using those kind of means will start to really do some fun stuff here.
Yeah.
Combined again with the notice and access and whatever else Universal Proxy allows them to do. Go ahead. Sorry.
No. By the way, I'm sorry if my screen is coming dark. The sun is not working in my favor. I'm not trying to look mysterious. So yeah, I mean, it really depends. I mean, I'm about to work on a campaign where there's very little institutional ownership, but it's mostly retail, and the company hasn't provided us with the no-go list. So we're going to have to do a heavy social media campaign. That's just to reach an audience. So both social media and also obviously press releases and such, but also in some industries, depending upon the industry and the age group around, who follows the company, social media can be an effective, particularly around ESG, can be very effective. So I think we'll see a lot more of that.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I've been pushing over the years is to try to get more voice for workers. And so I was trying to get disclosure of how many shares are distributed to workers, but I got a no action because that's apparently secret information, business, except that, the businesses have to go out to their shareholders to get approval to give these shares to their workers. And then we can't find out how they've been distributed. But there's many companies like, say, Procter & Gamble, you just mentioned. I think workers at Procter & Gamble own about 10% of the company, maybe more. But typically also, I'm not sure what the case is at Procter & Gamble, but at a typical ESOP where you're required to pass the votes through, only 10% of the shares get voted. So it seems like social media could be somewhat effective or possibly effective in activating the voice of workers who own shares in companies who are frustrated with how they're treated at those companies. This is another avenue for them to use. So.
Yep.
Well, are there any questions out there? We got a lot of people on the line, but I was surprised, was kind of holding questions to the chat, but it doesn't have to be on the chat.
Anyone want to raise their hand?
Yeah, you could raise your hand and we could put you on. Any souls out there? I don't see any hands, so. Wow. I thought this was.
We were that good, Jim.
Yeah.
It's Eric. I've got another one.
Good.
To what extent do you think institutions are equipped to deal with the added complexity from UPC on top of the more prominent contested elections that might be out there? Are they, or does this just work to further empower ISS and the proxy advisors and everything associated with trying to influence them?
I can jump in on that. I think that the institutions are equipped to handle it. I think from an institutional standpoint, it's a little more of a mechanical issue than anything else. I think it gives them a little more flexibility. They probably have to do more work to do a deeper dive into each individual candidate, on both slates. So it's certainly a little more work, but and obviously, we'll see how it plays out this year, this coming proxy season. But I don't see any unusual hurdle. And of course, for ISS and Glass Lewis, it's additional opportunity for them.
I was just going to say that ISS and Glass Lewis both wrote notes to clients, and Glass Lewis sent theirs as a release, so that you can go read. And if there any indication about what their clients are thinking, they've said, yeah, it's a lot more work for us. We got to compare individuals and so forth. They've said not a whole lot's going to change about how they think about contested board elections. But they're saying, yeah, it's going to take a lot more work for us to compare individual candidates, for us to make sure that the candidates are, linked back to the case for change and so forth, that they, could conventionally look at when they're evaluating a contest. And they've said it a lot more working and wait longer for your report or so forth. So you got to get there sooner, I suppose. So yeah, it's going to take a little more intense effort among voters, shareholder voters, to really do this. But yeah.
So you guys have been monitoring these universal proxy cards and proxy contests for a long time.
Yeah, there's been 2 or 3 so far in 2022. There hasn't been a ton, but there are 3 or 4 notable ones that were the first and second and third proxy contests. Go ahead, Jim. I'm sorry.
Well, do you think we're likely to get to the case where there's multiple candidates running for the same slots. I mean, one of the things that brings to, CalPERS, I've got experience with them because I ran for the board so many times and whatever, but one of the changes that I got there was a majority vote standard, because at one point they had so many candidates running that they had a plurality standard like most companies do if there is no majority vote. But so now they have a majority vote standard, and when someone doesn't get a majority vote, it costs them an extra $1 million to go out and do another round of voting. So are we going to see corporations where, you have an election of a candidate with, 30% of the vote because there's
multiple
candidates?
I don't know, John, what do you think?
I could see that happening. Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe we need to move to a instant runoff elections for.
Well, I don't know. I mean, again, the idea that, contests are, the perception that contests got to be a lot less costly than they could have been, or than they were in the past. It inevitably leads, if price goes down, supply goes up, or demand goes up. And so there are going to certainly be at least a few more at some bigger companies where one or another, proponent that had been content to just, submit proposals says, okay, this is something for us. I've heard from a few folks that are already starting to think in those terms. So inevitably, at some of the biggest companies, there will be more than one activist trying to, and then the lesson there is you got to get there early. If you're thinking about that, you need to act sooner rather than later, to try to get the best nominees, to try to, get attention from institutions, shareholder votes and so forth. So doing it sooner rather than later, if that's what you're thinking, probably is wise.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I wonder if there's any headhunters or whatever that are out there specializing in ESG.
There's a couple.
I don't know.
They're out there.
Yeah. Binders full.
Yep, right, exactly.
Okay, any other questions out there?
I don't think so.
Let's see if I had anything here.
Here's another question that just came in, Jim.
Okay. Oh, how will the rise of pass-through voting at BlackRock and other firms intersect with UPC? Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's.
Yeah. It's probably going to make UPC even more relevant. That the idea that there's going to be a much longer list of shareholders rather than just trying to go to the big three. I clearly it's going to make solicitation a lot harder, but it will, because I started alluding to some of the strategic implications of universal proxy, where how people, the change in how people vote changes how activists think about their slates and how big their slates are and so forth. When you're starting to appeal to a much larger group of individual investors, that's really going to have matter in terms of how you position those candidates, and so forth. So it's a little early to know, especially because pass-through voting is we just basically finished the first year of it.
Well,
and
but and
it was
most
a fraction of shares. Go ahead.
Well, help explain to me pass-through voting. I don't know if it's actually passed through for, I guess in some cases they're passing through to a large institutional investor that holds at BlackRock or whatever. But in many cases that I've read, it's more of kind of a survey of the sentiment of their investors and then adjusting their proxy voting policies is.
That's
so
exactly right. All right,
Right.
so there, go ahead, John. I'm sorry, did you say something?
No, I was just agreeing with Jim.
Yeah, so a big institution solicits input
Right,
from its customers or its account holders
right,
about how that institution should vote. I think there's a manifestation where in fact they actually pass the voting, but most of the time it's just, what's your input, and
Yeah.
it's not just merely input, it's how do you want me to vote this on this proposal or for this candidate. And then, you're going to be appealing them. It could be institutions that are, account holders at one or another fund, or it could be a foundation, something like that.
yeah, it's kind of funny because,
Yeah.
people complain about the ISS has so much power,
Right.
but that's what they do. Every
Right.
year they solicit from their customers, how do you think we should be voting or recommending on these issues, and then they come
And
up
there are
with-
resourceful enterprises that are starting to try to take advantage of this and start to try to aggregate individual investor preferences
Yeah,
in various ways.
we've had several of them
Right.
as
I'm
here.
involved with one called Awake that would
Uh-huh.
be is worth your time.
Awake.
Worth looking at. Awake, AWAKE.
Uh-huh,
Disclosure, I'm an advisor to them.
uh-huh.
But there's others that are out there
Yeah,
where we're trying to figure out how to communicate effectively with those voters, especially as they're now having a lot more power. So yeah.
right. Okay, well, we've reached the 10 o'clock hour and past it, so hold it. Elliot Waxman, can we unmute you? You can just come on here. I don't know how to to unmute. There you are. Elliot.
Sure. I was just clapping. I was using the clap
Oh, I thought you had your hand up.
to applaud for the hour. Nope. That's it.
Okay, all right,
Thanks for answering my question.
all right. Okay, I guess, and let's see. We're gonna be, we took a long break to get here to this program. I've got Nell Minow kind of waiting in the wings. Unfortunately, I have to go for eye surgery and it's much more complicated than I thought it was gonna be. So I don't know when we're gonna be back, although maybe Eric will come up with a guest in the meantime. I don't know, but so it may be, I don't know, February, March, something like that. So just stay tuned. And thank you very much, John and Michael. I thought it was very informative.
Our pleasure. My pleasure.
I